So before moving into our panel session, I'll just talk just very briefly about the UNCRC, just to give you some very base level information that can help shape your thinking as you go on. So the UNCRC is an international human rights treaty, and that grants all children and young people under the age of 18 a comprehensive set of rights to ensure minimum standards for children. It covers civil and political rights, as well as social, cultural and political, or sorry, economic rights. And it seeks to protect children from harm, to provide for their growth and development, and to empower them and their participation in society. The UK ratified the convention in 1991, and the UNCRC is the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history, signalling its importance across the world and in a recognition of children's rights. The rights in the UNCRC are described in a series of articles, but essentially they can be grouped into three core areas. And this is really helpful for us to think about in terms of the work that we do and try to locate our work within those articles. So the first grouping is around provision and those services that children and young people need to survive and to develop and to reach their full potential. So here we can think about things like housing, health, education, nutrition, transport. The second is around protection. So from protection from harm and abuse, from protection from those things that threaten the dignity of children and their ability to survive and develop. And finally, around participation. And this is about giving them a voice in decisions that affect them and allowing them to engage in public life. Importantly, this gives them agency within their own lives and moves children and young people away from being, I suppose, a sense of things that have a charitable status or are in need solely of care. One of the things we often hear about why it's important to do the right thing by children and young people is that we hear that children and young people are the future, and that's why this work is important. But I think it's also important for us to remember that the children and young people are citizens of the present. They're here today and they are part of our communities and are service users in themselves as well. If you want to learn more about the UNCRC, there are some links that we will put in the chat, and you can explore more in the accompanying paper that we have going alongside our event today. So we're going to move into our panel session now, and I'm going to come to Jenny first for the first question that I have for you, is really to ask you to share your perspective on why children's rights are an important consideration in Scotland's planning and placemaking system.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. It's really lovely to be at an event discussing this, which is a topic that I'm really, really passionate about. So I think, to be honest, the children of Cork have probably made it quite clear why they should be an important consideration in planning and placemaking. But I think a really important point is that children and young people, they are very sensitive to their local environment, and they also use their local environment more than any other demographic group. So if we're talking about the real experts on where they live and what's there and what's not there, what makes them feel safe, who the people in the community are, then from our experience at A Place in Childhood, children really are incredibly good at that. They're really good at the fine-grained detail of what their place is like, and they experience it from, I guess, one of the most vulnerable perspectives as well, where traffic safety, is something that really needs to be considered. Places for play and for seeing nature are often kind of very high up on their priorities. And they're also incredibly, in general, caring and conscious of their community, conscious about environmental matters. And so in many ways, I think just talking to children and young people and taking a children's rights lens to planning and placemaking is the way to really make sure that what we're doing is sustainable, essentially. And I think also, some people think that maybe if we ask children and young people what they think, they're going to ask for the world. But actually, they are often just asking for incredibly sensible things and just very kind of community-minded things. So you'll have seen from the children in Cork there, a lot of what they were talking about was litter and just making their place feel kind of calmer and more caring and better for the environment. So those are the kinds of things that we see all of the time from talking to children and young people. And also just fundamentally, I'm sure a lot of us are kind of aware on this call that childhood is changing really fast. So, you know, in the 1970s, it was possible for children to kind of go out and explore their local environments and maybe not come home for hours, but that's not really the case for many children now. They often don't have a lot of places that they can go to play that feel safe, and they don't have a lot of independence and freedom. And a lot of that is to do with the amount of traffic that we have on our roads, or also kind of the perceptions that people have of each other, as we don't have the same sense of community as we used to. So I think there's a lot of things that kind of planning is able to kind of correct for. And when we're designing kind of environments that are going to work for our present and future generations, planning is really the key to actually coordinating all of those different systems and things within placemaking, so that we can take a children's rights lens, especially considering that some children's rights, you know, are quite difficult to achieve because, you know, individual families will have all sorts of things going on. But what we can have is an influence over the places that children are, and that can be a protective factor for all sorts of other things that might be going on in children's lives. And I think just it's really important not to underestimate just how absolutely vital children's play is for development and for health across the life course. So anything we can do to facilitate children getting out and about, active and playing, is just going to have absolutely fantastic effects kind of for everyone.
Thank you, Jenny. And you're right. I think that perspective on the changing nature of childhood and the interaction that our environment can have with that is really significant thing to think about. I suppose if we were thinking about how we put some of that into practice, what would you say the core elements of a children's rights-based approach to planning and placemaking looks like?
So I think a really core approach is putting children at the centre of our processes. I'm just going to attempt to share a screen just to show a couple of examples of what it can look like when you ask children and young people about what their places could be like. So if I put it on the slideshow, it goes very strange, but this is a project that we've been doing as part of a sort of Scotland-wide 20-minute neighbourhood project. And this is an example from an area of Falkirk called Bainsford and Langley. So we've been working with Falkirk Council and with Pastoral to think about how Bainsford and Langley's could have a children and teenagers plan for their area so that it could really put their needs kind of at the forefront of it. So an approach to this, I think it mostly involves starting with the children really and giving them the opportunity to really explore things in a developmentally appropriate way, and for then us as adults to respond appropriately to that. So for example, we've done this project where we created these maps and we created a set of priorities and plans with pupils from the area at the high school and then the 2 local primary schools. And the children took all of the photos of what was important and told us where it is that we needed to go and what the main issues were. And then we facilitated through some experiential processes to get them to create their plan so that it's really from their perspective and from their voice. And here's a kind of a more zoomed in version of what that looks like for one specific primary school. So you can see that the things that they were talking about is that nature needs to be protected and wildlife needs to be increased. They think that the area really needs to be cleaned up, and they were particularly concerned about an area with a lot of broken glass next to one of their local shops, which stops children and young people getting out and playing. They also felt that a lot of their antisocial behaviour issues are because teenagers are bored. So even primary school children were telling us that the teenagers needed a hangout space. And then they were also talking lots about safety, about lighting, about reducing the speed of the traffic, and just really about thinking about how the community could come together around the things that really matter to them, and also celebrate their community, because children and young people are often proud of where they live, but don't have that opportunity to actually get together with the community. And I think we'll probably all appreciate that with austerity and things, a lot of community events have kind of been lost alongside COVID having taken away some of the things that children used to do. So by doing this project and seeing what really matters to them, we got the priorities from each of the groups about what really mattered to them that they would like to take action on most. And you can see many of the themes kind of coming up here, which also include things around improving housing and facilities that help us stay well. And this project was about 20-minute neighbourhoods, but we didn't at any point need to say to the children, this is a 20-minute neighbourhood project, because they already think that way, because they already just walk if they can cycle, which many don't feel safe to do, but if they cycle, then those are the two ways that they get around in their neighborhoods. They don't have the option as children to get in their own car. So if they are going to get driven around, then they're dependent on the adults around them. So they tend to have this very kind of fine-grained local look at what could be done. You know, seeing what they really want to make happen. They're not massive asks. They're things that if we can kind of come around it and find the right stakeholders, we could start to make these things happen sort of with and for them. So part of this project as well, to bring what the children and young people said about their place to the attention of adults that might be able to have an impact from the community and from the council. We put on this showcase event where we had representatives from each of the schools and they came around their plans and their priorities, and we invited stakeholders that might be able to have an influence over them so that we could have honest conversations around what's possible. So it's kind of getting a little bit out of maybe the usual silos that we work in and have kind of conversations directly with the children. And actually a lot of the time it's also raising their awareness of how change happens. And we find as well that children and young people are actually very good at responding to constraints. They just don't always know what they are. So having those conversations really helps kind of manage expectations and negotiate and kind of come up with long-term plans of how we can work together. So that's an example of what it can look like, which I hope helps set the scene a wee bit.
That's great, Jenny. And I think it's really interesting to hear about the kind of things and issues that children experience and their just kind of almost natural understanding of an environment, and that 20-minute kind of concept being very natural for them. So thank you for sharing that example with us. Irene, I'm going to come to you next. And obviously the place and wellbeing outcomes are really focused on creating places that thrive. And I think that concept of thriving place is really interesting. Can you share your perspective on how we can think about children's rights in that context, and maybe share any examples from the work that you've been doing that kind of highlight that or have made that happen for children and young people?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I think the whole thing about a place doesn't thrive. It's the people in it that have that chance to thrive. And that's why we need to have this far greater focus now on place as an outcome, as a way of actually delivering around planning and all of those aspects of planning a place, not just the planning department, but housing and transport and regeneration and working with community planning. There's a joined up collaborative approach here that needs to be taken to be able to deliver these places. But what the place and wellbeing outcomes do is it gives a consistent, comprehensive set of here are the outcomes we need to achieve for those that are using those places to thrive within them. And it was interesting listening to that video. A lot of what was being mentioned were outcomes that sit within the set of outcomes that we already have. But it is important, I think, just that emphasis about this is about people that are always at the middle. If you've seen the place and wellbeing outcome wheel, and there's loads about it on the Improvement Services website, it's people that are at the middle of that. And for ourselves, when we're considering how we deliver around those, how do we get those outcomes happening, it's the decision-making processes of all of those organisations that I just listed, and the third sector and the private sector and the house builders and so on, that have to come together and work in a place-based approach to be able to deliver upon it. For ourselves working on that, I mean, you know, children make up about a fifth of our population. Do we spend a fifth of our time on engaging and consulting with them? I think some services do, but certainly not all services do that. And then for the work where we've been progressing with Shaping Places for Wellbeing programme on how do we embed the place and wellbeing outcomes into decision making, in a lot of those areas it's child poverty that is one of the population groups that is most experiencing inequality. And we'll know already that the stats that, you know, that's a quarter of children in Scotland that are experiencing child poverty. So I think it's also running it through that lens when we think about the place and wellbeing outcomes and what we want to deliver. I think having those outcomes anyway for Scotland helps us with taking a child rights approach. But I do think that if we look at each of them, there are areas that definitely lend themselves more to giving further consideration to children. But there's already evidence there that helps. So if we think about the movement aspect, that links in so well with what Jenny was just saying. We can talk about how we move around, how we walk and cycle, public transport, and how we slow cars down in a place. And all of that is about creating somewhere that is easier to get around and to move around. Now, I always cite the numbers of people that do not have ownership of a car. So in Scotland anyway, it's a third of all households. But when you get to deprived areas, it's a half. But when you get to children, it's none of them. Absolutely none. They are all reliant on being moved around by somebody else. And that doesn't feel like we're really enabling their rights if we're creating places that are meaning that they're always having to get a lift off somebody rather than be able to move safely around under their own steam. And Catherine Trebeck, who deals a lot with, the well-being economy and the promotion of that, cites that as one of the measurements of a successful country, rather than growth and how much rubbish we can all buy, how quickly we can buy it, but how many 12-year-old girls can cycle to school in a country. That is a measurement of the success of a country that is creating places where its people are able to thrive. So I think that's a really great one within that movement theme of the place and wellbeing outcomes that is very specific for enabling children and their development and their best interests for them to be able to do that. But actually, if we did that, it would help all of us. It would help the entire population as well. When we think about the whole spaces element of the place and wellbeing outcomes, so the access to play parks seems the most obvious one that I think we go to. But even within that, we're very prone to just putting in a little toddler play park within a development rather than actually thinking about the range of population in an area, the different needs, the asks of spaces for girls. And, there's an awful lot more that can be done with the kind of play parks that we consider in any development and in any regeneration and change within an area as well. But I think that access to other aspects like the civic space, that came up there in the video as well, that when we're thinking about our streets and spaces that we're creating little pockets of space for people to come together and spend time in is an important aspect, as is things like a community garden. Wester Hailes Community Garden have links in then with the Wester Hailes High School, and there's a great relationship building there about an understanding of earth and of getting your hands dirty and of growing things. And all of those things linked up together, they're really helping our children to get around. They're helping their cognitive skills when they get to school, and they're helping their social skills and their physical and their mental health as well. So I think those two parts of the place and wellbeing outcomes are the really sort of shout out ones when it comes to children's rights. But I do think that access to resources and affordable housing, they're important aspects for children, again, to have things to go and do and activities. And if we don't have enough locally available facilities and things for children to go and do, then again, they are not building the social skills and having that access to a fuller life as well. And then finally, looking at the civic space, talking there about litter, that's part of that civic is how do you maintain our places? So there's an obvious input there. Children are smaller, they notice litter far more than we do, and we notice it a fair bit anyway. But also that feeling safe for a child being a different connotation. And I think again that looking at what is safe in an area, we could do a lot better by thinking about it through the eyes of a child, and then it would feel safe for anybody. And I suppose the final one around the stewardship and looking at that sense of influence and control is an important aspect of the key elements of what is coming through around children's rights and their ability to participate. So that's an important one that kind of sits apart around actually having the kind of processes like you just showed there in the video that can pull in what is that additional information that children have about their area? I think the other outcomes can sit there, and we can use evidence and common sense to think about a child. And get on with it now is what I'm meaning, that we don't need to go out and await getting that input, but getting that input, getting that lived experience of children into what they're thinking for their place is crucial, as it is with any place that we listen to people. But if we've got a fifth of the population represented by children, then we need to make sure that we are in and focusing on that. I think for ourselves in the work that we've been doing, one instance that we had was what we do within the Shaping Places for Wellbeing programme is that we look at what the data is telling us about a place, and then we think, how can we bring that into the decision-making processes of different plans and strategies? And one that we looked at was in West Dunbartonshire, where the Community Planning Partnership had a delivery group that was to deliver a safe West Dunbartonshire where everybody feels safe. And there were a lot of actions in there around better street lighting and things like that. But when we came in with that idea around what the Icelandic model is with Project Youth, that if we want children to thrive, if we want children not to end up with so little to do that they are getting involved in substance misuse and so on, then the Icelandic model has proven that they need to have activities 2 to 3 times a week that are out with the requirements of school, that are separate to that. So we need to build a place that actually supports that to happen, that has the amenities and the resources, that has the ability for children to move around and get to those different activities under their own steam, not relying on anybody else moving them around. So if we're actually creating that kind of a safe environment, it is beyond just planning to do that, but planning can put that foundation in and can lead now with local development plans, like the example in Cork, of setting that tone that then others can come in behind and play their part in it. But they certainly can't do it on their own. We do need to have that broader aspect to it.
Thanks, Irene. That's fantastic. And I think one of the things, just picking up on that issue of transport, is that when we look at the articles in the UNCRC, there isn't one that says children's right to transport, but we can see transport as an enabler that helps the realisation of children's rights in terms of things like their access to education or their access to play and rest. So really important to think about planning and as an enabler of the realisation of children's rights. And I think that example of transport is really key in terms of that. And also
planning does that without just being able to put in walkways and bus services. It can do that down to the density that it builds to. If it keeps building out with low density 4-villa detached houses, then that density requires a car to actually get to anything. If we keep doing that and we're not actually creating that local living that serves children in a far better way. So it isn't just about the ability to have a walkway or a bus, it's building to a density that makes public transport viable, that makes different facilities viable, and makes the whole area more walkable.
Thank you. Craig, I'm going to come to you next. And as I was thinking about Scottish planning system, and the paper that we've written goes into some of the statutory kind of elements of that. And we do have a duty to consult with children and young people, and a requirement for play sufficiency assessments. But it's interesting to hear that we have a broader understanding of the importance of planning in realising children's rights. So in your role as a National Planning Improvement Champion, where do you see that going, and what do you see that needs to change to enable this to happen? It's maybe a big question, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rebecca. Yeah, I'll certainly try. I think it is important, not just me personally. I think government, I think the profession thinks it's important. I think, as you said, through the various things and hooks which are in place just now, there are lots of things which are changing the way in which the planning system and the planning profession works. We've been on a bit of a journey in planning from probably about 2016. We've had a large planning reform programme. it's been really interesting to see how that's developed and evolved over time. And I think the whole idea of children's and young persons' rights and involvement in the planning systems comes really to the fore in that. I think prior to that, it wasn't really a thing, to be frank with you. And that's really quite interesting, in that we now have a purpose of planning, which is to manage and develop land in the long-term public interest. And you said earlier on, children are our future, and songs like that. But there's so it's important that we start to think about what the future looks like, and the custodians of the future have to be part of that process as well. So I think that's something which is very much agreed. The interesting thing for me around the things which we have in place just now, and you said it yourself, Rebecca, it's quite a lot of focus upon engagement. And that's great, that's really good, and I can see things happening in that. So there's things in the 2019 Planning Act which mention it as well. As you say, there's a need for place sufficiency assessments. The National Planning Framework, which is just over a year old, talks a lot about young people and children, the need to engage them in the process, and to get them involved in some of the policy making aspects of that as well. I suppose for me, I think we're building on that just now. We're at a stage where we're having a new planning system coming into play. We're in the very early sort of years of that. So we're at that stage just now where we're building the evidence behind what our development plans will look like for the future. And as part of that process, every planning authority has to develop an evidence report which looks at what's out there, so it becomes the basis for them developing their policies and their draft plan. So I think all that stuff's working really well in terms of engaging, and I think we're seeing things happen. I think the first evidence report, which has been published, is by Fife Council, and I know they engage with Planning Aid Scotland, do quite a lot of work with young people across Fife to try and to inform that. So that's all good. But for me, I think the interesting thing is going to be how that translates into policy, how it translates into delivery, how it's monitored, and how it's reviewed over time as well. That's, I think, going to be the real test for it. Jenny mentioned 20-minute neighbourhoods. I'm fascinated to see what a child's perspective is in a 20-minute neighbourhood, and how that can then be built into policy, which is replicated in a development plan and taken forward to make decisions on planning applications as well. I think there's other things in the system which we have to think about how we can influence them to make sure they say the right things. I'm really interested in thing called local place plans, which are sort of community-led plans in Scotland. The Planning Act says nothing about young people in there, but you would like to think the people who take those local place plans forward will make sure that young people and children are involved in that, or that maybe a group of young people or children can actually do it. I don't know if that's the type of work that Jenny's doing. Seems a bit like that in many ways. But I suppose one of my fears is that local place plans may be developed by people in their 50s and 60s who want to stop development happening, whereas we want it to be a much more engaging, a much more positive, and a much more proactive way of doing things as well. So I think that's going to be the test in terms of the influence, and the in terms of the policy, test in terms of how those policies make the right decisions, which actually really future-proof what we're trying to do. I was at a really interesting event last night in the Scottish Parliament. This brings in another thing about how we can try and test the policies and can bring the evidence to see if policies are working. The event last night was organised by Planning Democracy, who sort of promote more involvement in planning. And they launched a report where they had brought together a group of community individuals to monitor biodiversity policies in the National Planning Framework. It was a really interesting approach to that sort of community-led scientist idea of monitoring things. And I'm just wondering if there's things there we can replicate in terms of how we monitor our local development plans, as to how we can get people who are going to face the consequences of the policies within them to look at what the direction of travel is on policy making and delivery around it as well. So I think there are things like that. And I suppose the other thing which I think is really important is trying to make sure that as a profession we have the behaviours to make sure that we do embed, embrace and put front and centre children, young people in terms of what we deliver, in terms of the places on the ground. So Irene's point about outcomes is incredibly important. One of the things in my job is I have to, my role is to monitor the performance of planning authorities and to give them advice on how they can improve. And as part of that, one of the things we're doing right now is developing a new improvement framework for planning authorities. And it's part of that. It sounds really boring, but what I think is really important about it is that it can have an impact on behaviours, because what you're measured by makes you do things in a different way. So we're trying to introduce a new approach whereby we measure what the success of a planning authority is through different attributes which we think signify a high-performing planning authority. So that's looking at things such as the people and the skills you have, and there is a skills and a knowledge issue for the planning profession in this. We're on a journey with it, no doubt. I think we're doing relatively well, but we need to build upon that. So we need to try and test that as part of the performance. There's a bit about the culture of the organisation, what leadership you have, how you can improve what your governance is like, and how you and also how you engage with different people and communities. So we want to try and measure that. And there's a bit about trying to make sure that the tools you have to do the job, such as your development plans, is actually working effectively, and working effectively in terms of the outcomes we're trying to achieve through the National Planning Framework, which I've already said is putting children's rights front and centre, I would imagine, as well. But importantly, it's all about outcomes, and Irene said that, and I think we'll probably say that about 3 or 4 times during today's conversation, because it's true. It's really, really important. That's why we do planning. We do planning to create great places for people, and we need to try and measure that. So we're looking at using the place and wellbeing outcomes as a measure for that, to see if we can make sure that planning authorities, the way in which they work, the things which they have to make it work, actually help us to get to the things we want to achieve.
Well, thank you, Craig. And obviously there's lots of elements to that. And I think that opportunity to get involved in something like that new framework and to have children's rights as part of that conversation and thinking is a real sign of progress, and that recognition of the importance is really good to see in that context. So thank you for sharing those insights for us. I suppose then for both Irene and Craig, I'm going to ask you this around the work that you do with the different local areas and with the profession, as you mentioned, Craig, and how I suppose we can make sure that thinking about children's rights isn't just another thing to consider. You know, it's just another thing in a long list of things that people have to do. How do you think we can encourage people to think about children's rights as just a core part of what they do, not an added extra? Do you have champions out there that we can draw from their experience and things?
Can I go first, if that's okay, and maybe build upon what I said a wee minute ago? For me, it's all about behaviours and making sure we have people with the behaviours to take this forward and to embed things in what we're trying to do. The performance and impact of the performance assessment process we're going through is very much trying to do that. I mentioned it's about outcomes, and we're trying to allow people to think through how they can make that work. We want to make it a very collaborative exercise, and what used to happen in the past with how you measured performance was that the Scottish Government used to tell you if you were doing good, bad, or in somewhere in between, and go away and just deal with it. I think what we're trying to do with the process now is very much make the ambitions you're trying to achieve the important thing. So trying to figure out how you improve and what you change to make things happen, and embed that as part of how you work. So a process will involve getting planning authorities to look at the different factors I mentioned earlier on, but thinking about not just how it performs just now, but how that becomes a springboard for change. So as part of that process, we're looking at a range of indicators under, for example, the outcomes and engagement. One of the things we're looking at in that is children and young people, how they've been engaged and how we can make that work. So that in itself can maybe try and make it an imperative that you look at this as part of your work. And I think the other important aspect for us about trying to help embed that approach is I issued a few months ago what I called a call for ideas on what makes a high-performing planning system. And children's rights and the need to engage young people was something which came through quite strongly in it as well, which is great. I think it shows it's taken seed, which is useful. But I think it is part of that process. One of the key messages that came through was we need to collaborate better. And I'll be totally frank with you, when I saw that come through, I've been working in planning for 35 years, and for each of those 35 years, everyone said to me, we need to collaborate, but we haven't really done it. So what we're trying to do is to give some practical steps to make sure that happens. So as part of our review process, we're expecting planning authorities to undergo some form of peer review. And that peer review will include other planning authorities, it will include government, ourselves and others, but it will also involve those who benefit from the planning system, the planning service as well. So we're still in very early days of that, what that looks like, but hopefully that collaborative approach will just make it a natural way of trying to make things happen, and it becomes to the fore. So rather than, as you say, that stick on, that add on at the end of the process.
That sounds great, and I love the idea of children and young people getting involved in a kind of a peer review process, and what that could lead to could be really interesting as well. But certainly the weight that's been given to the importance of including children and young people in different ways is a really positive step forward. Irene, can I get you to come in on that question as well?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. As part of the work that we've been doing for 3 years in working locally in places on just how do we embed the place and wellbeing outcomes and get them into decision making, when there's a new decision, a new plan, a new policy being considered, we have gone in and just done a half-day session where we have looked at that plan, that proposal, and run it through the lens of, is it delivering on all of the outcomes? And where it is or where it isn't, could it do a bit more? Is there more that could be included in the plan that would help it to deliver upon all of those outcomes? So I think the fact that part of that work has involved doing local development plans, looking at existing local development plan visions and ambitions and high-level strategies to see how the next iteration of the plan could be taking into account all of these outcomes is one aspect of, as we say, if you're delivering upon that in any of your urban areas, that means you're delivering the kind of local living that supports children. But another aspect is that other plans and other strategies have then ended up putting content in that is more supportive of delivering of just the kinds of things that were being raised in your video from Cork. So now a health and social care strategy that used to talk about the importance of prevention, but was really talking about inoculations and smoking cessation, is now highlighting the importance of green space and having that locally available to all of the population. And really just, I suppose, using the kind of evidence that sits behind the place and wellbeing outcomes in, one example being green space. If children grow up within 500 metres of green space, they're 60% less likely to have mental health issues later in life. That's huge. And that needs to be taken account of when we're looking at plans and strategies. And all the different plans and strategies need to support each other around being able to actually deliver upon that when we're looking at change in an environment. The National Planning Framework was a long way to giving planning authorities a new set of things to deliver upon, and I welcome that wholeheartedly around health and well-being and reducing inequality, and that's over and above the ask about consulting with children. But we do need to have everybody talking a little bit more and plans and strategies that align and support each other. And that's been a key output from the work that we've done, is bringing in different perspectives into those sessions. Now, when we chat about this, we've had perspectives from community in there. We've either had the third sector in those sessions, or we've had our own community link leads in there. But I do think, as you say, there is an opportunity moving forward to make sure that there's a representative there of children's voices as well. I'm not saying a child sitting there in one of these sessions, that would not be fair on them in the slightest, but somebody who's frontline working with children and has that understanding of those inherent problems that they're having in an area would bring a lot of value into that process as well, especially when we're looking at things like local development plans, local place plans, and what do they include as we move forward. Then there's a real opportunity within that process.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you both for taking that question. Jenny, I'm going to come to you for the next question. And we've had a lot of questions in the Slido relating to engaging with children and young people, looking for some kind of practical examples, or, you know, people feeling, how does that work? And there's a lot to think about there, including maybe kind of a consultation fatigue for children, young people, being asked the same things over and over and not seeing action. So I'm wondering what advice you would give to somebody who's feeling a bit anxious, who is asked to take this kind of work forward. Where would they start? You know, what would be some kind of really fundamental things? And I know that you've been doing some work in your Teenagers in Public Space project, and I think that could be a really a good example for others to have a look at. Can you give us some advice and tell us a little bit about that project?
Sure, yeah, I'm just going to share screen again just so that you can see some of the outputs from that project. And I should also say that in terms of like practical guidance, we are at A Place in Childhood going to be launching something in April, May time based on the project we've been working on children and young people's 20-minute neighbourhoods across Scotland. So I showed some of the outcomes from that from Falkirk before, but we are putting together a how-to guide about that place-based work with children and young people, and bringing that from the very start of kind of working with the children and young people, and then into like better conversations, and then into outcomes. So I can't provide that right now, but that is something that's going to come out. And of course, a good starting point as well is to have a look at the children and the young people's versions of the Place Standard tools, for a bit of inspiration about how you could start those conversations without having to you know, go completely full blown on everything. And I guess the initial advice I would always give people before I launch into talking about something more complicated is like, just get started in some ways. Like, it's completely fine if it's not perfect. And I think sometimes we get a bit worried that it's not going to be perfect, or we're going to be kind of upsetting children or whatever, but actually they just enjoy being asked. So, and they're quite good at working out your general character. So if you're going in there with good intentions, especially with primary school children, and you're asking questions, and all you really need to ask is, what do you like about your area? What do you not like, as a good starting point, then actually you'll get really good information, and you can kind of always build from that. So I'd say there's loads of really great stuff that you can do. And I'm going to talk through some methods that we'd really recommend, but just in general, don't let fear get in the way and just get started, because actually children and young people aren't as scary as they can seem. Often it's just because people haven't spent very much time around them. And also we live in a society where we're quite segregated generationally, and that's not how it used to be, but that is how it is now. So that kind of increases some of the fear that we have of each other. But actually, we're all just humans, and fundamentally children are humans. And even when their behavior is maybe a little different to what you're used to working with, often it really doesn't mean much. Then they want to be seen and they want to be heard. So that's a general bit of advice. But in terms of the Teenagers in Public Space work, this is something that we did I think sort of 2022 23, and that was really trying to understand the teenage perspective of what places are like for them, and particularly around their access to public space. So one of the articles in the UNCRC that sometimes gets a bit missed when it comes to teenagers is this right to kind of gather and organize their own activities. So you're probably all aware that teenagers often don't have the best rap in like public space, and they're often seen to be kind of up to no good regardless of what they're up to. So sometimes they are doing things that they shouldn't be doing, but often they're just kind of hanging out, and that's quite misunderstood. So Sustrans wanted to work with us to find out a bit more about how they could engage more with teenagers in like a child rights based way, but also how they could have better conversations between members of the community and adult stakeholders around kind of what teenagers need, so that there's a bit less of that kind of rubbing heads that there can be. So what we did for this, it was with like a piece of participatory action research. So it was really practical. We worked in 3 different case studies, so Huntly, Denny and North Edinburgh, and each of these was linked to a one of the Places for Everyone projects that FusTrans was funding. So there were local partners on the ground that were actually going to be delivering active travel infrastructure and placemaking interventions. So we worked with young people in each of these places through like a 3-stage process. The first is what we call experiential mapping, which is what I'll talk through in a moment. Then we had a local strategy workshops, and then we had national workshop as well to kind of think about strategy. And we also in North Edinburgh, we had this really great opportunity to co-design some new public space. So one of the main things, and this is what we would always recommend if you have the chance to go out with children and young people, is we did our experiential mapping process. And this is about creating maps with children and young people based on their lived experience of place. So we always go out on walks, which they design, and they're really good at designing a good walk. And then we go out on that. We give them cameras, get them to take photos of what's important. We take lots of notes as we have good conversations about their place along the way. And in this project, because we were particularly interested in gender-based differences, we did separate walks with the girls and the boys in each place so that we could talk a bit more about safety or things that I think especially the girls might not want to say in front of the boys, but also kind of vice versa. So that gave us really, really good insights. And the walk is always a really enjoyable part of the day. Some outdoor learning is a really good opportunity. And you can see an example of this experiential map here. So this is Huntly in Aberdeenshire. And from everything they told us, we kind of talked through the walk when we got back. We were able to say, you know, this is what the girls said, this is what the boys said. And also by doing that, we were able to bring some of those conversations into the full group that maybe would have been difficult for, say, the teenage girls to say in front of the boys and have a shared conversation about it. And you can kind of see the different things on here that they wanted to improve. And a lot of it was about the lack of things for young people to do and how that leads to poor behaviour. A lot of it, and this is consistent across Scotland, is also just that they feel that adults don't really appreciate them being out in public space and that they're often kind of moved on. And that a lot of the antisocial behaviour from their perspective is adults towards young people, and actually less young people kind of doing it towards the other people, though that is obviously also something that happens. So this is an example from Huntly. We've got an example from Denny as well. You can all look at these in the final report on teenagers and public space if you're interested. And then in Edinburgh, we did this with several different groups, but then eventually we also ended up involving the whole of S5 at the local school. So this map involves, I think, about 125 young people in total. And so some of them went out on the walk. We did several different ones with youth groups and with schools, and then lots of them in sort of PSE classes also just added to this and added other things they thought were important or good, what's missing or could be better, and things to change. And these are really the broad questions that we find to be really effective to ask children and young people to get their views. And from these conversations, kind of the ideas of what is missing, what could be better, what their priorities for action come out really nicely. And that's also obviously something you can do with the Place Standard tool, and you can do it kind of with that, or you can do it separately from that. But you get really good outcomes just by working with young people on the ground. And then here is an example of the co-design that we did in North Edinburgh, as there was an opportunity for some space to be freed up outside the local high school that could be used for creating like well, whatever it is that they wanted. And here's one of the designs for the bigger space where we just gave them free rein to use different tools. They could draw, they could write, they could use Minecraft on their own iPads. They could get things from the internet as inspiration, use tracing paper on the main maps that we had. And we went out on site visits, we took photos, we brought in some examples of things that they'd mentioned in the first session they were quite interested in. So things kind of like what good hangout spaces could look like for young people, because there's not a lot of examples they knew about. And then they put together this combined vision that actually just really served the whole community. And they were thinking about how is it that we can make this place for the local special needs school? How can we make sure this is safe for girls? And a main way they said is actually if we make it family friendly and we make it somewhere that people can see what's happening, and it's got a hub of activity, and it's kind of based around things that the community can come together on, they thought it would have a better chance of not being vandalised and being respected much more. So it was really, really fantastic ideas they came up with, which we hope will at least inform the final designs for the area, and hopefully actually elements of this will be really, really clear in that. So we're still waiting on the outputs of that. But the other thing we did as part of this is we facilitated local strategy workshops, a bit like what I spoke about in Falkirk, but we did these online with teenagers and with a variety of stakeholders from each place. And within that, we created essentially a youth-friendly environment and invited adults in, which is kind of flipping on its head the usual way we do things, where we're trying to invite young people into a very adult environment that is actually quite intimidating and we don't always realize. So we were trying to make it a youth-friendly environment that the adults had to come to. So it was an environment and a time that they had set up and said that they would make them feel comfortable. And we spent some preparation time with the young people before the adults came in, so that the adults were also fully briefed before working with the young people about how to work together. And then we did a range of kind of activities with the idea that we would take the priorities that the teenagers had come up with to the adults. The adults would tell us kind of what's already happening, what they find interesting or motivating around what the young people have said, and how they think that we might work together in future. And then from sharing these ideas, they then got into kind of like task forces based on their interests, and that were a mix of young people and adults, to discuss these even further and kind of come up with a route map for how they could improve the local place for teenagers, but also how they could keep the conversation kind of going in future. So we did this in each place at the local level, and then we also had a national one where we brought together the young people that wanted to from all of the places, staying with the local stakeholders, and then also involved some national stakeholders from kind of Sustrans wide to discuss a kind of final set of outcomes and what we call route maps for improving the situation for teenagers across the country. So you can have a look at that in the report if you're interested. But just to finish on talking about this, these are the recommendations that we had to Sustrans, which they are now looking at taking forward in any way that they can into their ongoing infrastructure projects. So a lot of this is about safety. A lot of it's about really focusing on community-based actions that make people feel safer, and also building the meaningful engagement of young people into projects at the start and having a plan at the start on how that can be embedded over time. So a big part of our recommendation is really that doing this kind of really high quality broad-based engagement, it naturally just covers lots of different issues, and then you can go back and you can kind of delve in a bit deeper on other things. But actually, once you've got this plan that covers lots of different things, you don't have to keep going back, because you've got this really thorough thing that the young people have been involved with. And it's also just about creating a trustful dialogue and being transparent when engaging with young people, because they actually really want to know what's happening, and they want to know why some things can't happen, and that at least by telling them that, they understand how change can be taken forward and what role they can play. So that's a kind of a bit of an insight into the ways that young people could be involved in these processes. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Jen. I think that's really helpful, and it's really good to see a real practical example of how you've taken that forward, and some tips and techniques in there. It's really great to see. And I think just what you said at the outset about just making a start and having a conversation with children and young people, I think is the best advice really, that we can make it into something bigger than it needs to be, and it really is about that meaningful conversation. So I hope that has answered some of the questions that are in or have come through from you in terms of practical resources to help you to do the kind of engagement work that's needed. And we will share Jenny's slides and lots of other links to some practical tools and resources as well. And we've got some other examples that people have helpfully shared with us as well. So thank you for doing that. It's now time for some questions that have come through from Slido, but also to hear from anyone in the call who wanted to share any of their experiences of working with children and young people in planning and placemaking. If you'd like to share that with us, either through the Slido or the chat, or to raise your hand and speak with us, you're very welcome to do that. So I'm going to take a few of the questions from Slido, if that's okay. I'm going to come to Craig with you first, and there's one there around an expectation on private developers to engage with specific consultee groups such as children. What are our expectations on private developers in this context? What role do they have to play?
As far as I'm aware, there's nothing specific in any rules, regulations or whatever, but I would like to think the spirit of what's been taken forward through things such as the Planning Act and the National Planning Framework, which, as I said previously, put these things front and centre. It was something that would look at. I think one of the things that private developers have to do if they've got a major planning application, they have to undertake what's called pre-application consultation, where they have to hold a couple of events and they have to do things with the local community to try and make sure that, or to get views from them on what the development should look like. I'll be honest with you, I'm not aware of any young people specific PAC events which have taken place. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen, and I think it's something we should be trying to push them to do as much as we possibly can. They're building things for future generations as much as planners are trying to build policies on it. So there's something we're trying to see how we can perhaps push that forward. And that's something I'd probably like to take away, is because although my focus is on looking at the performance of planning authorities, I am allowed by the Act to talk to other people who have, who I think are important in delivering the things we want to deliver through the planning system. So it's an interesting question. Unless Irene knows of anything else, I'm sort of putting the spot there, Irene, but I don't think there is, so.
No, thank you, Craig. I think under the UNCRC, services that are procured from public bodies, such as a local authority or a health board, because the what they will be delivering will be of a public nature, they will be required to act compatibly with the UNCRC. So, while private developers are maybe slightly different to that, it does pose some potential thinking that we need to do around the role of private and non kind of duty bearers in that space, and what role they're playing in delivering place-based approaches, and how the UNCRC will interact with them. So maybe something that we can all give a little bit more thought to as well.
I wonder how that focuses on social housing as well. There might be something in there because they've been procured through government grants. So yeah, good point.
Yep. Okay. Do we believe that there is fatigue of consultation of children and we find the same answers? Is it the action that's missing? So Irene and Jenny want to come in on that one. Thank you. So Irene, will I come to you first?
Thank you. Just to say, I am genuinely fed up with that term, community fatigue. There isn't community fatigue. If we were asking communities what they wanted and then we were making things happen for them, they would be back at us coming up with other things. So it's not fatigue. It's getting a bit fed up about not knowing what's happening. And things are slow, particularly in planning and in councils and that movement. It does take time, and I think we need to explain that. But yeah, I don't think that it really is a fatigue. I think it's with all of the fantastic examples that we've seen today that you need to complete that circle and go back and let people know what has happened and that it's still being progressed. It hasn't been lost. And we found in some of our work where we've gone out to look at what previous engagement has happened in this area, and that's been general engagement. And there hasn't always even been a write-up of that engagement that other people could use. So therefore, you've used up people's time, your own time as an organisation, and your community's time to simply burrow away what you found and progress with it, rather than to actually put it in a document, share it so others can also use it. So that would equally help with the limited resource that we've got, is that when we are engaging, we need to come together around that. And that's, you know, just back from Shetland, where they're looking at 3 capital projects in one area, and they're going, we need to pull together on what it is that we can do here, and then go and talk to the community about how they can do this with us. So there's got to be an awful lot more of that, yes, but completing that circle and letting people know what's happening, I don't believe that it is fatigue. I think that's just an easy term for organisations to use to somehow put it on to communities, which I don't think is fair.
Thank you, Irene. Jenny.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Irene has said there. I think that, yeah, the fatigue, if we are going to call it that, it comes when communities have been asked, there's no change, and then you ask them exactly the same thing again. And I would ask, why are we trying to ask them the same thing again if we've already got the results? Then yes, there definitely should be action. I think a lot of it is not closing the feedback loop, like Irene said. And I think also with the work can include a wide range of different areas. So, you know, if it's purely planning and we're going in and all we care about is the land use planning matters, then the community will always feel like they've not been heard. But if we can go in as, you know, working with children, it doesn't work that way anyway. There's no way you can go in with a group of 8-year-olds and tell them what they can tell you and what they can't tell you, because they're going to tell you everything. But then if you do a kind of a place-based plan and you get a range of different actions, some of them will be planning and they'll be long-term and they'll take a while to deliver. Some of them could be, we want to go on community litter picks, and that's something that the community can deliver. Or we can go back with the school and we can get some litter picking equipment and we can go out and do that with them. A lot of the time they want to do things like planting trees, and that might be something that the school can do with them. So if we have a range of actions, some of which are easier to achieve and some of which are longer term, then we can get some sense along the way that actually things are happening and keep that kind of that ball in the air and that conversation. But the other thing I would say, because we get asked this question sometimes, but for the most part, children and young people have not been engaged at all. So the idea that they would have fatigue is, it just doesn't make any sense, because if we don't involve children and young people, they can't be fatigued yet. I think that we need to actually be involving them more, and then just thinking about how we can keep the conversation going. And then I don't think we'll have the problem.
Great, thank you so much. And I suppose if we think as well about the age of children and young people when they get involved, a year in a child's life is much longer than a year in an adult's life, isn't it? So we need to maybe think about the pace and timing that we feed back to people, and think about the academic school year and how we do that as well. There's a really good question come through on the Slido, and it is, once we obtain kids' feedback, how do we get government, schools and general public to change their mindset to one that considers youth opinions as valuable? And I suppose one of the key things that we highlight in the paper that supports this work is around public attitudes to children and young people, and Jenny, you've talked about it just there in terms of teenagers in public space, and we still see the use of things like mosquito devices and no ball games and all of these things that tell us you know, children shouldn't be here. Have you any thoughts on that, and how do we get that public mind shift happening? And Irene as well, this will have come up for you, I'm sure, in the local areas that you've worked with.
Yeah, for ourselves, it's looking at what the different decision-making processes are of, and organisations will have different ways of doing that. So we've been doing that through our place and wellbeing assessments. But likewise, if you're looking at a planning authority, then it's including your findings into the committee report that's making that decision. And, you know, I've got examples myself of going into schools around Edinburgh and having conversations when there was Edinburgh were looking at relaxing the policy on Princes Street. It was always shops, and they were wanting to introduce allowing restaurants just because of the way retail shopping was moving at the time. And children loved it. They wanted places that they could go and sit and hang out in Princes Street with their friends, where our, you know, other community representatives, which were slightly older and represented a completely different demographic, didn't want it in many ways, because they felt, well, we might end up with an awful lot of McDonald's and that chicken place that they all like. Now, you need a balance when you go to committee. That is what it's about. And so I think it's important, as Jenny was saying, that you just go and do something, and then you have that balance to reflect in something as simple as a committee report, which then did inform the decision-making process. So it's within the fingertips of us all to actually do that. But there are other processes that we've been formalising more that can help also.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Irene. Yeah. Jenny, and then Craig.
Yeah, no, so I would just add, yeah, a lot of what Irene has said, but a big thing that we can do as planners or other professionals is that we can advocate for like the views and the ideas of children and teenagers. So in those, when you might be having those community conversations, and I've been in plenty of them where young people are, to be honest, being slagged off a lot. And a lot of the time it's unfair and there aren't young people to defend themselves. And even if young people were in the room, that's not a friendly environment to defend them in. But we can stand up and be like, well, you know, experience of working with teenagers is that they often say they don't have any space. They often feel that they're misunderstood. A lot of them don't go out because actually they don't feel welcome where they live. And a lot of these problems we see with teenagers, you know, a lot of, it's not everyone, but a lot of people will complain that teenagers are spending too much inside, but at the same time, they often have more freedom on the internet and on kind of computer games than they do in their everyday environment. So I think it's just kind of bringing that into the conversation so that the other members of the community can at least hear it and potentially respond to it. And that might also, the ones that actually do agree with that, it might give them a little bit more strength to be like, actually, you know what, I've got a teenager at home and that's exactly the case, or I spoke to him and he wanted this. So I think it's just, we can add balance to that conversation, even if the community's not directly kind of coming forward with it. But I think the other thing is just having those direct conversations where people can speak across different perspectives, and that can be difficult to bring about, but we can do that initially, at least with adult policymakers and stakeholders, inviting them to these events, and like some of the ones we had in the work I shared, so that they can have those conversations and actually realize it's not that much of a difficulty to actually speak to teenagers about quite serious topics. Obviously with children you need to take a slightly different tact, but they can understand a lot more than I think we often assume. And if we have those direct conversations, we can get to what the real heart of the issue is rather than what people's perceptions of the issue are. So yeah, and I think just the final thing is if we can just create places where people can actually come together and see different perspectives, that's also going to help. So I think, you know, it's a screaming need from all of the work we do for teenagers to have places in public space to hang out, because it's so hard to point at examples of where that is a case where they actually genuinely feel welcome. And if we had more of that, then we would see more of a different side of young people as well, and also disperse their behaviour. You know, sometimes they congregate all in the same area because it's the only place, and that's not necessarily their choice or what they want. So
thank you, Jenny. I think that's some really important points there. Thank you. Craig, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, just briefly, I mentioned earlier on that I think the real place where everything's happening around planning just now is around the engagement side of things. So planners are actually hearing what young people and children are saying. So I think there's a need for us to actually be their voice or be their translator in some ways, or to at least give them the opportunity to be the voice as well. And I think, as Irene's touched on, evidence is a really important part of that. Any policy maker or decision maker I know really likes to look at evidence. So I think there's probably a wealth of evidence out there which can show the benefits that you can get from taking a child-based approach to this as well. I also wonder if there's something about using the things which we have to open people's minds a bit more. And I'm thinking of a really, really practical thing. There is, through the 2019 Planning Act, there's going to be statutory training for planning councillors. And I'm slightly worried that might just be about what a development plan is, how you process a planning application, and the sort of I don't want to say boring, that's not true, but the sort of the bits you do on a regular basis, the practical elements of it. I would like to see some of that training be about raising people's sights about, one, the value of planning, but I think as part of that we can see how the value of planning can link in with how we engage, work with, and take account of the views of children and young people as well. So there might be something we can do around that.
A couple of more questions still coming through, which is great. One is around how do we make sure that those at the kind of top levels and in leadership roles are kind of engaging in this and taking on board, particularly if they've trained quite some time ago. And there's also a comment of the average age of a planner being 42, and is that a problem? Craig, I think that's one for you to.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm over the median, so that makes it even worse. I think it is an issue I have generally with the planning profession. It is an ageing profession, and the demographics aren't good. Most planners now are over 50s, over 50. So we need to get more people into the system, and I think that's how we do it. I'm always very conscious that when I worked in my previous job and I worked for the RTP, I used to get asked to go to talk to schools or to universities. And I always thought, no, I'm not doing that. That's not. I am not the face of the future of planning. We need to get young people in there, enthusiastic, keen people who are showing a key difference. So that's something we need to do. We need to do it generally anyway for the profession, because there is a real shortage of planners, our pipeline of planners going into the profession. And there are some interesting things happening down south. There's some interesting things. They've got Pathways to Planning a programme which is looking very much about how you can bring graduates and young people into the profession and showing them that the profession, despite what you hear, is not boring, is not always confrontational, but it's actually about making a key difference. So I think we need to recalibrate what planning is seen as to try and make it a younger profession. The problem we have with that is it's not going to happen overnight. So I do think there's a need for the more senior members in the profession to actually have a much more open mind on things as well, and to be creative as they possibly can. The slight issue I think which we have as well is, I talked earlier on about my call for ideas and what the contributors were to a high performing planning system. One of the things which was mentioned as a key component by virtually everybody was the lack of resources in the system generally. So in some ways that mutes the ability to be creative and to find the space to do some of this stuff. Some of the stuff Jenny's doing is absolutely fantastic, and I imagine it's quite resource intensive, however, and just freeing people up to do that has been quite difficult. So I think we need to think about how we design our services almost to try and front load a lot of this stuff, because we will get the benefits from it later down the line. We might not need the same amount of resource later down the line.
Thanks, Craig. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. We've still got a lot of people still with us. So there's a question around play sufficiency assessments, and we've not talked a lot about play today, but the UNCRC does specifically refer to children's right to play, and there's a lot of really great work specifically on the right to play happening. So the question is around, how can we get buy-in from environment colleagues and play experts on play sufficiency assessment? They tend to see it as a planning authority only requirement. Craig, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can come in a wee bit on that. I suppose I think it's interesting. There are regulations out in play sufficiency assessments, which I think are actually quite light touch, but they're quite useful in doing different things and being different points about things. But one of the things they mention within it is the link between play sufficiency assessments and open space strategies. And I wonder if that's the hook for this, to get environmental groups into this, because they will have an interest in open space as well. And there's an obvious link between open space and play, particularly for informal play. So there might be some route into that to use the regulations as a means, or as a lever to try and start that conversation with some of those colleagues.
Thanks, Craig. Jenny, can I bring you in on this one as well? And just in your experience around the right to play and planning, what kind of advice could you give to people who are maybe getting involved in these assessments, and where to find some examples?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So I think just building on kind of what Craig was saying, I think a good way to get other colleagues involved would actually be to just ask them what questions the play sufficiency assessment might be able to answer that they're interested in as well, because it might be that you can kind of club resources in a way. If they can be part of the team understanding what you're looking for, then obviously there's the regulations that need to be met, but there could be other things that become part of the conversation. Or it could be that if you look at those regulations together, you realize actually that question could help us understand, for instance, how we could use the money we have to upgrade playgrounds most effectively, because everyone is kind of resource constrained. So that could be a really effective conversation. So we look at everything about play kind of at once, rather than, oh, well, that's planning thing, and next year we'll launch our consultation on this. So that's just one thing. But yeah, I think on place efficiency assessments, I think it's going to be a really, really powerful way to bring children's needs directly into planning. I think it's going to challenge us as planners, I think, but in a way that I think we just need to be. And it's going to be really useful to see the places that they go and where they don't go, especially when we think about more informal spaces. Because I think there's a presumption that everything needs to be provided through playgrounds, but I think we often forget that playgrounds were an adult conception to begin with. Children didn't design playgrounds. We decided that that was a way we could solve the issue of children having no space to play, or no safe space to play. So we created those for them. That's not necessarily where they would choose to play. So I think especially in some rural areas, we might find that actually the provision for play is just quite different from what we might have on paper. And in urban areas, it might give us really good insights into how some of the places we might not have considered being a core place for play could be improved just a wee bit and actually could be a place that they value much more. So I think it could be challenging, but I think it could be really exciting. And I think certainly from our perspective at APIC, I think if we can put children and young people's voice at the heart of that, because who can decide what place efficiency is? I'd say it's only really children that are going to know what is sufficient for play. If we as adults are going to go around and try and work out if a place is sufficient for play, it's going to be very time intensive, and we're not going to do a very good job of it, especially not if we're trying to be a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old all at once. That's cognitively impossible. But also if we can kind of just ask children and young people the way to do it, and we're trying to think of some ways that we can kind of do that through a place in childhood. And we have previously worked on a place efficiency assessment, and we worked by just kind of sending out really simple surveys to children and young people to find out where they go, where they don't go, what's good enough, what could be better. And we kind of hope to think about transforming that into ways that we can involve as many children and young people as possible to get the best insights. So I would just say that I know it's a challenge, and especially with resource constraints, we can't necessarily go out and do plans in every single neighbourhood. But if we can look at ways where we can link our geographic data with the views of children and young people, then we'll get most of the way to kind of a place efficiency assessment just by asking children.
Thank you, Jen. I think that's really helpful and really practical advice. I know my children always play outside the official playground where there's a pile of sticks or stones or leaves preferably, and because they're quite different ages, I think it works much better for them. So that concept of what sufficient play spaces is very difficult to get a handle on. There is a question in our Slido around children's rights wellbeing impact assessment and how to do those in a meaningful way, and possible links with other impact assessments. So just a note on children's rights wellbeing impact assessment. They are a requirement that will come to the Scottish Government under the new UNCRC legislation. They are good practice for other public bodies to undertake if you are looking at the potential impacts of a new policy or practice for children and young people. So in terms of kind of resources, the Scottish Government have on their children's rights web pages some examples of templates and guidance that you can use to undertake an impact assessment. But in terms of involving children and young people, there is a resource that was developed and launched last year by the Children and Young People's Commissioner's Office, specifically around engaging children and young people in children's rights wellbeing impact assessment, and Felicia might be able to pop the link to that in the chat, or we can circulate it afterwards. But in that resource pack, there's a lot of really useful tips and tools and little kind of crib sheets that you can use to help you to engage with children and young people meaningfully in the impact assessment process. And in terms of the links with other impact assessments, things like sustainable impact assessments, equality impact assessments, GDPR impact assessments. There's a whole range of different ones out there. A lot of local authorities are integrating the consideration of children's rights into their impact assessment processes, and certainly through our work on UNCRC, we will be looking specifically at that and be able to share some examples of practice with you as well. So if you're interested in that particularly, and you're not on our mailing list for the UNCRC support already, just drop me an email and I can send you more information and invite you to the session that we'll be having in April that's looking specifically at impact assessment as well. So are we okay for a few more questions, panel members? Yeah. Okay. There's a really good question posed around how to engage children and young people with additional needs and developmental difficulties. Jenny, can I come to you on that one, please?
I think it's a really important question, and I think that the trouble with a really simple answer to that is it really depends on what the needs of the children and young people are. So some young people might just have like a developmentally younger age than their years suggest, in which case tools that you might use with younger children, more play-based kind of tools, simpler questions, a more kind of immediately fun kind of approach is going to support that. If we're talking about children and young people that have, say, autism, it might be a different approach. It might be actually having more kind of individual one-to-one conversations, but it also depends on needs, because, if children and young people are kind of non-verbal, then you might need to find different visual ways that you can talk about things. So it's very difficult to give an overall example on that or advice, but I think a really key thing to do at all times, and this applies to any engagement with children and young people, but if you're going into a school or an existing group, is just work with the person that knows those children. So they'll be able to kind of guide on what is an appropriate method. You could put forward some ideas and they can say, that won't work because of this, or that will work for almost all of our children, but maybe we can do this slightly different thing with this child. So I hope that's helpful. There's lots of different ideas around, and there's methods that have been used with kind of early years and stuff that could be used with young people with more severe needs and things. But I would always ask the people that work with them, and sometimes their mode of participation might need to be more kind of observation. And that's also still a legitimate way of trying to hear their voice, but their non-verbal voice. But if anyone wants any more specific information on that, I'd be happy to guide on specific examples.
Thank you, Jenny. And I know East Lothian Play Association did a specific piece of work to engage with parents and young children and young people with additional needs in East Lothian. So it might be something that we can find out a little bit more from them and share with the group, if that would be helpful as well. Okay. See what else is in the mix, or if anyone wants to come in and share an example of some of the work that they're doing, if they don't want to add that to Slido. There's one here. Is there any sort of scale or balance which can assess or evaluate comparative holistic thriving between areas? Irene, I'm going to come to you on that one. Do we have a scale, or is it more about looking at the standard in particular areas? What are your thoughts on that one?
I'm not sure why you would want a scale to say this area is thriving more than that area. I mean, you could do that with the Play Standard tool across Scotland. It's been used. You could sit and say this area overall, where it's been used, has a far higher score on this than it has there. But that may just be down to how the cultural way that people are judging things in different parts of the country and everything. So I'm not aware of there being such a thing. And I think it's the sort of thing that could throw up an awful lot of anomalies behind what you could get from it. So I'd be happy to hear of any examples where that's something that would work. But I think the whole thing about a place-based approach is you need to deal with that place and not be trying to compare it to another and make it like another, because every place is different and the interactions are different as well.
Absolutely. Okay. I think most of the other questions relate back to some of the points that we have already covered off in some of the other areas. But I just wanted to give each of you a chance just to share any kind of last reflections that you have on this, and maybe something that you've heard today that you hadn't heard before and found particularly useful. So Irene, can I come to you first?
Yeah, I think for my own reflection, it is in the work that we've been in and doing for 3 years that I don't think we've had enough of a focus just on children's rights. We have had a focus on child poverty because that has tended to be an issue in the majority of the areas that we're in and working on, but not on that actual rights of a child. So that is something for me to take away and to reflect on in our work as we go forward. And then just one other thing you'd said, Rebecca, about there was a question about assessments. And I do think it's a very busy place with assessments right now. I know, I've been talking about our place in wellbeing assessments also. And I think we just need to be quite clever on how we do these assessments so that we can combine that work up so it doesn't become so overwhelming that actually the impacts aren't really even easy to take on and to mitigate or to change our decisions around. So for ourselves in the work that we do, we link into the integrated impact assessments that many are working on, and we provide a substantial input into that. There's something maybe to be linking up there around the fact that if we look at the protected characteristics, we're also looking at children and children's rights. Therefore, that could be a means in to connect up as well. So I think there's some clever thinking, just as we're saying about engagement needing to link up, and maybe need to be doing more around that also.
Great, thank you, Irene. Craig, can I ask you the same? Any kind of reflections from today?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. So thanks for the invitation to be involved in it. And I've learned a lot. Because it's good to bring this mix of different types of disciplines and professions together. So there's always learning in that. So thanks for that. I suppose I go back to what I said at the start about, I think the planning profession and the planning systems on a bit of a journey. And I think the engagement stuff is where most of the focus is just now. We do have to shift from engagement to policy and influence to then decision making to then review. But from what I've heard today, I think people are up for that. I think there's ways in which we can make it work. I think there's been some fantastic examples that Jenny's given and the type of things we can do as to lever that in as well. But I suppose what we need to do is think across all the people involved here is how we can support that in terms of the skills, the knowledge and the capacity to try and do that and get the time to be that little bit creative, as we've said. So I think that's the key issue for me, which isn't a new issue in many ways, but I think it's still an important one.
Thank you, Craig. And Jenny, can I come to you next?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me along to this. It's been so interesting to hear from Craig and Irene and also everyone's questions. And I think my takeaway is also people's questions have been really interesting, like really wanting to make a difference, really wanting to think about, okay, well, we've asked children, what do we do next? And that is really motivating, I think, from my perspective, because that's something that we would love to work out how that happens. And I don't think any of us have really got all of the answers on that. And I would love for there to be some fantastic case studies from Scotland that we can really show this is what children said, this is what happened, this is how we kept the ball in the air in the conversation, and then here is the outcome. So it makes me really pleased to see that I think we've got loads of potential there to start doing things like that. And with children's rights coming out and lots of people asking how, is just such a good place to be in. So that's my main reflection. And I think the final thing that I would just want to say as well is that it is so resource constrained right now, and that is a real difficulty to be creative, as Craig has said. One thing we can try and do by putting children's rights at the centre is if we can invest in getting that kind of baseline understanding of what children and young people think of their place and what they need from that place, that could actually be quite an effective and efficient way to lay that bedrock from which we can then kind of pull pieces of information, take actions, make decisions without thinking that, oh, well, we've got to now go and ask them about this. We've got to go now ask them about that. And then having to come up with, you know, different sampling frameworks and things. If we do maybe one project that gives us a really good broad understanding to get started, then that could be a way that we try and bring children's rights more strategically into our work.
Fantastic, thank you. So I think I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon. I think it's been really insightful to hear from our panelists, and also to as Jenny's just referred to, see the positive way in which people are engaging with this. It's not without its challenges to think how we get over that lack of resource, but the willingness to have the conversation and listen to our children and young people is really evident from those of you that are here today and the questions that you've posed. So thank you so much for joining us and for sharing the links. A very special thank you to Jenny, Craig and Irene for sharing all of your insights with us. Thank you so much, and I think you deserve a very large cup of coffee to you know, restore yourselves after all of those questions, or kind of iron brew, obviously, yes. So thank you very much, and